The first signal arrived at 11:47 p.m. Not on a threat display, not on a radar scope, but on a low-band frequency analyzer operated by an electronic warfare technician aboard USS Diego Eisenhower, cross-referencing passive emissions intercepts against a classified library of known Iranian drone control architectures. It was a single burst transmission. Duration, 0.3 seconds. Origin bearing northwest toward the Iranian coastline. It carried no tactical identifier, no standard military formatting. To any automated system, it would have been flagged as environmental noise and discarded inside 40 milliseconds. The technician did not discard it. She had seen a transmission shaped exactly like this once before. In a classified after-action package from the Red Sea, documenting the pre-launch signature of a Shahed 238 jet-propelled variant in the 60 seconds before its first reported contact. She logged it at 11:48 p.m. She sent the log to her division supervisor at 11:49 p.m. She flagged it urgent at 11:50 p.m. By 11:58 p.m., the carrier strike group intelligence officer had pulled the intercept, compared it against 3 additional signals detected in the preceding 4 hours by passive sensors on USS Gettysburg and the guided missile destroyer USS Gravely. Signals that individually had been classified as probable commercial traffic and had reached a conclusion that the Combat Information Center's automated threat fusion engine had not. The 4 signals were not independent. They were a sequenced pre-launch calibration protocol. Someone, somewhere along the Iranian coast, between Bandar Abbas and the Shasham Island complex, had just finished telling a very large number of airborne systems where USS Diego Eisenhower was. At 12:03 a.m. on March 11, 2026, the strike group commander elevated the force to Condition 1. Every Aegis combat system in the formation went to full active engagement posture. Every vertical launch system was brought to readiness. The 2 E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft that had been flying a standard surveillance orbit 60 miles north of the carrier were redirected to an expanded threat detection pattern covering the northwestern approach corridor. The carrier air wings alert fighters, a section of 2 FA-18F Super Hornets armed with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, were launched at 12:07 a.m. into a holding position between the carrier and the Iranian coast. What was coming had been planned in the 48 hours following the U.S.-Israeli strike on Tehran on February 28th. The IRGC Aerospace Force had lost significant infrastructure in those strikes. Radar installations, command nodes, 2 primary launch facilities. But the decentralized architecture of Iran's drone program, developed specifically to survive the kind of degrading first strike that the February 28th operation had delivered, remained largely intact. Dispersed across 17 pre-surveyed launch sites along the coastal belt from Bandar Abbas to Jask, camouflaged under agricultural netting and commercial freight infrastructure, were 340 airborne systems of 3 distinct types. Shahed 136 loitering munitions with GPS inertial navigation, Shahed 238 jet-propelled variants with a terminal electro-optical seeker, and a smaller number, 41, of an upgraded variant that Iranian engineers had designated internally as the Qasef-4, carrying a modified guidance package that combined GPS, passive radar homing, and a machine vision terminal phase built around imagery of a Nimitz-class carrier's distinctive flight deck geometry. The Qasef-4S had been reserved. They were the penetrators, the weapons intended to survive whatever the Americans put between them and the carrier's flight deck. The attack had been designed around a principle that Iran's planners had extracted from 2 years of studying Houthi interdiction operations in the Red Sea. Volume defeats precision. A single intercept costs the United States Navy approximately $1 million and consumes 1 cell of a finite vertical launch system. A Shahed 136 costs roughly $20,000. The mathematics of industrial attrition, applied with sufficient scale and coordination, eventually produce a gap. The planners of this operation had calculated that gap at approximately the 290th incoming contact. Before that threshold, they projected Eisenhower's Aegis escorts would expend their primary intercept inventory. After that threshold, the CIWS-4 penetrators would face a degraded point defense environment. They had built 340 systems specifically to cross that threshold. At 12:19 a.m., the first wave launched, not from one location, from all 17 simultaneously. The E-2D Hawkeye operating in the northwestern corridor detected the launch signatures at 12:19:44 a.m. The radar picture that materialized on every Aegis display in the strike group over the following 90 seconds was, by the assessment of every operator who saw it, unlike anything they had encountered outside of the most demanding simulation environments. 340 tracks, moving at varying speeds on interlocking approach vectors, flying at altitudes between 40 meters and 600 meters, staggered in vertical layers to complicate single-altitude intercept geometries. The slowest were the Shahed 136 SO, subsonic, low, patient, designed to absorb intercepts. The fastest were the Shahed 238 jet variants, pushing 600 kilometers per hour in a shallow dive profile from the higher altitude band, and threaded through the entire formation, indistinguishable on radar from the surrounding Shahed 136. Were 41 CIWS-4 penetrators running at low altitude, quiet, waiting. The Strike Group Tactical Action Officer on USS Gettysburg committed to the engagement sequence at 12:21 a.m. The Cooperative Engagement Capability Network linking Gettysburg, Gravely, USS Leyte Gulf, and USS Cole into a single unified sensor and weapons architecture began assigning intercepts at 12:21:08 a.m. The first SM-2 missiles left their launchers at 12:21:14 a.m. The first ESSM quad pack engagements began at 12:21:19 a.m. The FA-18Fs in the forward holding position had already committed their first AIM 120 shots against the leading edge of the Shahed 238 layer at 12:20:58 a.m., guided by the Hawkeye's data link feed. The next 23 minutes were the most sustained high-density air defense engagement the United States Navy had conducted since the end of the Cold War. The intercepts were efficient. The Aegis system's engagement logic, refined through decades of software updates and operational data, was managing the threat density with a precision that bordered on the mechanical, prioritizing the faster Shahed 238 variants as primary intercept targets, assigning ESSM to the lower altitude Shahed 136 layer, feeding continuous target updates to the F/A-18Fs for beyond visual range engagements against the formation's outer edge. The intercept rate in the first 8 minutes was extraordinary. 94 confirmed intercepts, 0 leakers to the inner engagement zone. In the CIC of USS Gettysburg, the operators working the engagement displays were processing information at a sustained cognitive tempo that left no bandwidth for anything except the work. The lighting was red. The air was recycled and sharp. The sound was the continuous, overlapping cadence of system status reports, weapons away calls, and the deep mechanical percussion of the vertical launch system firing at a rate that was measurably depleting the ship's inventory with each passing minute. At 12:29 a.m., the Tactical Action Officer on Gettysburg registered the first inventory threshold alert, SM-2 reserve, 61%. The number was not alarming in isolation. In context, with 214 tracks still inbound, 17 minutes into an engagement that the system projected would last another 12. It was the first data point in a trajectory that required attention. She noted it. She did not alter the engagement sequence. There was no alternative engagement sequence that did not involve the same math. In the CIC of USS Gravely, operating on the strike group's northern flank. The atmosphere at this moment was a study in controlled extremity. Every operator at every console was running at a cognitive tempo that training had built, and nothing fully prepares. The track displays were dense. Dozens of symbology updates per second, intercept timelines stacking and resolving in overlapping cascades, each one representing a physical object crossing real water at lethal velocity toward the ship they were sitting inside. The commanding officer moved between consoles without speaking, reading the engagement picture with the practiced economy of someone who has spent a career building precisely this kind of reading comprehension. He paused once, for 4 seconds, over the inventory display. He moved on. There was nothing the pause could accomplish that the system was not already doing. What he was doing in those 4 seconds was something the system could not do. He was computing what happened if the math failed, and deciding that the people in the room would not let it. At 12:33 a.m., the first Shahed 136 penetrated the outer intercept zone, not because a weapon missed, because 3 intercept weapons had been simultaneously assigned to 3 different targets in the same geometric cluster. And the 4th target in that cluster, running in the acoustic and radar shadow of its 3 companions, had slipped through the assignment window in the 1.4-second gap between the 3rd intercept weapon's launch and the system's next track update cycle. It was not a system failure. It was the intended effect of volume. The leaker was detected at 12:33:17 a.m. by Gravely's fire control radar at a range of 9.4 nautical miles from the carrier. Gravely's tactical action officer committed an ESSM at 12:33:21 a.m. The intercept occurred at 12:33:28 a.m., 6.1 nautical miles from Eisenhower's hull. The warhead detonated in the air. Fragments spread. No ship damage. But the crew of Gravely knew what that track represented, and the knowledge settled into the CIC with a particular weight that numbers and system displays do not capture. At 12:37 a.m., a VLS cell on USS Cole malfunctioned. Not catastrophically, no cook-off, no structural damage. The hydraulic actuation system on Cell 14 jammed mid-cycle with an ESSM loaded and unfired. The weapons officer shifted assignments immediately, routing the cell's programmed intercept to an adjacent cell, accepting the 2.3-second delay that the rerouting introduced into the intercept timeline. The delay meant one Shahed 238 closed from 14 nautical miles to 9.8 nautical miles before its intercept weapon reached it. At those closing speeds, 4.2 nautical miles is approximately 19 seconds. The operators tracking that specific track had 19 seconds in which they understood, with complete clarity, what 19 seconds meant. The ESSM reached the target at 9.6 nautical miles. The crew of Cole, collectively, allowed themselves nothing. There were 163 tracks remaining on the display. The CIWS-4 penetrators, the 41 upgraded variants that the Iranians had reserved as their final penetration layer, began their terminal phase acceleration at 12:38 a.m. They had been running at the same altitude and speed as the Shahed 136 surrounding them, indistinguishable in the engagement display's track symbology. At 12:38 a.m., every one of them simultaneously executed a pre-programmed maneuver. Drop to 22 meters altitude, accelerate to maximum sprint speed, and activate the machine vision terminal seeker. The maneuver was detectable. The Hawkeye called it at 12:38 and 4 seconds a.m. The engagement network registered the track behavior change across all 41 simultaneously at 12:38 and 7 seconds a.m. The 3 seconds between detection and system response were the 3 seconds that the entire Iranian operational plan had been designed to manufacture. The tactical action officer on Gettysburg committed her remaining SM2 inventory to the CIWS-4 layer at 12:38:10 a.m. Eisenhower's organic CIWS 3 phalanx systems positioned on the carrier's sponsons and island superstructure activated simultaneously at 12:38 and 12 seconds a.m. Their fire control radars slewing to acquire the inbound contacts at the inner engagement boundary. The FA-18Fs, which had expended their AIM-120 inventory and transitioned to AIM-9X short-range engagements, were already inside minimum range for their remaining weapons against contacts at this speed and altitude. What followed was 61 seconds that the strike group commander would later describe in the classified after-action report submitted to 5th Fleet as the engagement margin. 29 of the 41 CIWS F-4s were intercepted by SM-2 in the outer zone. 7 were engaged by ESSM in the inner zone. 3 were taken by phalanx CIWS at ranges between 1.8 nautical miles and 0.6 nautical miles. The sound of the phalanx firing, that grinding industrial roar that is felt in the chest before it registers as sound, ran continuously for 44 seconds as the 3 closest contacts were engaged in overlapping sequences. The closest CIWS F-4 was intercepted at 0.6 nautical miles from Eisenhower's hull. The warhead fragmentation from that intercept produced a spray pattern that reached the carrier's starboard sponson. 3 sensor housings on the sponson's external face were destroyed. No penetration, no personnel casualties, but the fragment impacts against the carrier's hull audible inside the ship as a rapid, irregular percussion against the steel. Produced in every sailor who heard them the specific, irreducible understanding that the distance between training and consequence had just become very small. The final track cleared the display at 12:42 a.m. 2 leakers had reached the inner engagement zone. Both were intercepted by CIWS. 0 penetrating hits on any U.S. ship. The final inventory report, compiled at 12:45 a.m., documented the cost. 218 intercept weapons expended across 4 ships. SM-2 inventory on Gettysburg at 14%. ESSM inventory on Cole at 21%. Gravely's forward CIWS magazine at 28% capacity. The strike group had defeated a 340 system attack. It had done so with a margin that none of the operators involved described as comfortable. At 12:51 a.m., 2 squadrons of F/A-18E and F/A-18F aircraft were launched from Eisenhower's flight deck, carrying precision strike packages pre-targeted against all 17 Iranian launch sites, identified by the Hawkeye's launch detection data and the signals intelligence picture built during the engagement. The targeting solution had been computed by the time the last inbound track left the display. The strikes were coordinated with 2 B-2 Spirit bombers operating from Diego Garcia that had been airborne since 10 p.m. The launch site strikes executed between 1:14 a.m. and 1:41 a.m. All 17 sites were rendered inoperable. The infrastructure that had taken Iran 18 months to disperse and pre-position was removed from the battle space in 27 minutes. At 2:18 a.m., the strike group commander transmitted the after-action summary to 5th Fleet Command. 340 systems engaged, 340 neutralized, 0 penetrating hits, 0 personnel casualties, 17 launch sites eliminated. The numbers were clean. The condition of the ship's intercept inventories was not, and the summary noted this without ambiguity. The strike group required immediate replenishment to maintain full combat effectiveness. In a protracted engagement environment, the arithmetic of this victory pointed clearly toward a constraint that the planners of the Iranian operation had correctly identified and incorrectly assessed as sufficient. Volume had not defeated precision, but it had revealed the edge of precision's endurance. The replenishment request was already in the logistics queue before the after-action summary was transmitted. A USNS dry cargo and ammunition ship had been positioned at Diego Garcia under a pre-deployment logistics protocol that 5th Fleet had quietly activated 8 days earlier. At the first indication that Iranian coastal dispersal activity was accelerating beyond routine maintenance patterns. The munitions pipeline. The physical, irreplaceable supply chain of precision intercept weapons that sustains the mathematical dominance the Aegis system provides, had been treated as a strategic priority equal to the combat systems themselves. This was not standard doctrine. It was a lesson learned from 2 years of observing the Red Sea interdiction campaign, where the depletion of ship-based intercept inventories had become a defining operational constraint. The planners who had pre-positioned the logistics ship had read those lessons with the particular attention of people who understood that the most sophisticated combat system ever built is, ultimately, a container for a finite number of rounds. In the hours that followed, as the sun rose over the Persian Gulf and Eisenhower's crew began the methodical process of post-engagement assessment, damage documentation, and the particular quiet accounting of what had been asked of them and what had been given, the electronic warfare technician, who had logged the first 0.3-second signal at 11:47 p.m., was completing her incident report at a console in the ship's intelligence spaces. She was 26 years old. She had been in the Navy for 4 years. She had never been in combat before March 11th. Her report was technically precise, chronologically exact, and contained nothing that described what it had felt like to sit at that console for the 57 minutes between her first intercept flag and the last CIWS engagement. Nothing in the reporting format asked for that. Nothing in the reporting format could have contained it. The Persian Gulf is not a large body of water. On the morning of March 11th, 2026, it was navigated by one of the most battle-tested carrier strike groups in United States Navy history. A formation that had spent the previous 93 minutes conducting the highest density air defense engagement since the Cold War, and had emerged from it mission-capable, inventory depleted, and entirely certain of one thing. The adversary had found the edge of the system's endurance and had not broken it. Finding the edge is not the same as crossing it. That distinction between the edge found and the edge held is the only geography that matters in the Persian Gulf. The crew of Eisenhower lived inside it for 93 minutes and brought it home with them. In the silence that comes after alarms stop, when the display clears and the ocean outside the hull is simply the ocean again, indifferent and permanent and held open by the people who refuse to give it back. Victory in the Persian Gulf is not measured in numbers. It is measured in the silence after the last alarm, when those who held the line are still standing.